All right. It's a couple minutes after the hour, so I guess we'll get started. So hello, everyone. I'm Josh Rounds with the Minnesota Department of Health, the Minnesota Food Safety Centers of Excellence. So today we're going to discuss how the Integrated Food Safety Centers of Excellence can serve as a resource during cluster and outbreak investigations. We have three great presenters from states and a city that have used the CoEs during investigations to give you a sense of how the CoEs can help you. And after their presentations, I will discuss a few additional examples. And then after my presentation, we'll have a few minutes for questions. So please hold your questions until then. So our first presenter is David Young, who is an epidemiologist with the South Carolina Department of Health and Environmental Control. Just a quick note, he doesn't have slides, so you're not missing out on those. And I will pass it over to David. Go ahead and take it away, David. David, are you there? Can you hear me? You might have to unmute your phone if you're talking right now. We're having a little bit of trouble with David's audio connection, so we might skip him for now and come back to him. So our next speaker is Dr. Anna Carlson, who is an epidemiologist with the Nebraska Department of Health and Human Services. So I will share it over to Anna, and she will be able to share her screen. And
all right, hopefully I can figure this out. All right, can everybody hear me and see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Let's see if it'll let me do this. Is it showing up in note form, or is it?
It's showing up in the presenter form, so you might want to share the other monitor.
I'll just end. Oh, I can share the other monitor.
Yeah.
Let's do that then. I'm not sure it will let me share the other monitor, so I might just keep it like this if that's okay. So, yeah, I'm just going to give you guys a brief rundown of the multiple times. I pretty much use the CoEs for everything. When in doubt, I reach out to the CoEs. They've been nothing but an immense resource to our state in particular. So I'll just go through a couple slides of two outbreaks that we've used the CoEs in particular. The first one, and I apologize for anybody who's at the Inform meeting, this is going to be an overview of the same thing I kind of already talked about, but I'll focus on obviously the CoE interaction rather than CADT. So the first outbreak we had was a Campylobacter outbreak in water that was back in March, and the call came in on a Friday, of course. It was March 10th, and then for those of you that are in this specific region, it was the last day of the outbreak meeting, which was convenient that I had a bunch of EPIs around me, but also kind of stressful as I wasn't actually in Nebraska to start and initiate an investigation. So we had 6 lab-reported cases of Campylobacter come in a 1-week time frame. A small population of the town, so obviously I was pretty alarmed at this number based on the fact that the average number of Campy cases in this community was previously about 1 every 3 years. So I was actually hanging out with Rachel Jervis at that point in time that I got the phone call, which is convenient, and immediately, you know, she was like, here, take the hypothesis generating questionnaire. It was easily accessible on their website. This saved a bunch of time. I didn't have to create an outbreak-specific form. So we got this out immediately, and we're able to use it throughout the outbreak, which was really convenient. So we gained a bunch of information on exposures that are typical for Campylobacter and identified a handful of additional probable cases. So we were able to, by Tuesday, be boots on the ground and do an investigation of the town. We mostly tried to recreate distribution of poultry and ground beef. Really, we're running into walls. Didn't appear to be foodborne at this point in time, and we're told about standing livestock water that was seen in a roadside ditch. So we went on to identify additional probable cases that we learned about. At this point, we learned a bunch of information that was really pointing at this outbreak being potentially linked to a water source. So we went on to kind of talk to the water operators and gather more information. So a long story short, this ended up being a situation where a dairy on a hot day in February emptied their lagoon that held over 500,000 gallons of lagoon water through this center pivot number 3. The pivot wasn't winterized correctly. It broke. The water pooled on one side of the field and then drained down this hill into a roadside ditch that was right next to these well houses that fed municipal water to the town. So it was a pretty interesting outbreak. One thing I do regret was not calling the CoEs. You get in a point in an outbreak that you're pretty stressed, and one extra phone call sometimes doesn't seem worth it, but I wish that I would have made it because the water testing was kind of a situation that was a disaster that could have potentially been avoided. So if I had called, I could have probably been put in contact with somebody that knew something about water testing, so I didn't have to learn all of this the hard way. So what we found was for Campylobacter, testing for coliforms and E. coli, we of course tested, everything was negative. I think this is for a handful of reasons, but that's a long story. But we found out coliforms aren't really a good indicator for Campylobacter contamination. This is something somebody probably could have told me if I had reached out to kind of people that had already experienced this type of outbreak before. And then Campylobacter testing was actually also negative. So what we found through later research was that Campylobacter actually goes into a viable but not cultural state in water. So kind of lessons learned. It was also maybe a situation that I shouldn't have done any water testing at all. Trying to explain to the town mayor why all the testing was negative, but we still thought that the water was the source was very challenging. And when the report came back about the negative testing, it prompted City Hall to immediately release a media statement saying public health proves it's not the water. So I also lesson learned in media. It was a little bit of a rough outbreak for me, but when in doubt, call. They can probably put you, if they don't know the answer, they can put you in contact with somebody who does. So what was really great about this outbreak, we'd never had a municipal water outbreak in Nebraska that we knew of. So we had the CoE come out and do a hot wash, which I had never done previously. And this was a perfect outbreak to do one, I think, because we had never worked with the Safe Drinking Water program before either. So it was a challenge in itself, just working with a new group that we didn't know people previously. So they came out and facilitated an outbreak hot wash. I didn't have to do any of the work. They pretty much took care of everything, made flashcards, organized the whole thing, put out a questionnaire of what people wanted to discuss. Rachel really created a comfortable environment for everybody in what was potentially an uncomfortable meeting. Hot washes are always a great idea, but not always the most joyful experience. So in a heated moment or heated discussions, she really played the part of kind of a referee and kept everybody on track and on point, which having someone else do that's not me was immensely helpful. So our second outbreak in July was Salmonella enteritidis associated with a contamination event that happened at a restaurant. And the outbreak timeline, things happened pretty quickly. On Friday and Saturday, So about 7 people sought health care at a local hospital. People were tested with the gastrointestinal panel, and all positive for Salmonella in the 2-day time frame. So we had a situation where like a local health physician actually reported the commonality of a restaurant exposure, which I had never experienced that before, but was obviously kind of gave us a head start on things, which was really nice. But it also made things move very quickly. The state Epi was out of town as well as the deputy state Epi during this time. And it ended up being probably the largest Salmonella outbreak that I think I've seen in the 2 years that I've been here. So, you know, we moved forward. We had the Ag, Department of Ag on site for an inspection, continued to do case interviews. Everybody reported eating at Restaurant A. The next day, Department of Health and the local health department went on site, and we actually were able to identify that 2 ill food handlers were working in the kitchen. We took rectal swabs on all of the employees, and 3 employees ended up being positive for Salmonella. I had never dealt with a positive ill food handler situation before, so that was something that was new to me. But within a day, we were able to exclude everybody from work. The restaurant stopped serving high-risk food items, and the GIP was continued to be used as a frontline test for patients who presented with any sort of GI illness. So 25 people actually ended up being tested independently of public health, which was also a new situation to me. And this was all in like a 4-day, 5-day time frame. So things were moving a little too fast for me to keep up. So I contacted Minnesota. Within, I think, 5 minutes, Amy and Carlota had us on the phone talking to them since it was enteritis. Carlota is obviously an expert in enteritis. So I had a ton of questions since I was kind of alone at that moment. So we were able to identify, as I said, ill food handlers were obviously an issue, but at that point, were we done with the investigation? Are we satisfied with just knowing it was an ill food handler situation, or did we want to know more? So I also had a situation where we only surveyed the people who ate at the restaurant. So how do we show the restaurant was significantly associated with illness if we only surveyed that population? So Carlota also went through an example of calculations on how we could show that the restaurant was significant based on population size, which was immensely helpful as well. I had a lot of questions about testing. Since it was enteritis, we thought maybe it was a cross-contamination event that happened in the kitchen that made the food handlers sick because they ate at the restaurant frequently. So I wanted to know, was it worth testing the eggs? They were able to go through pretty detailed explanation of how contamination in eggs occurs and what contamination patterns look like when enteritis is egg associated. And then also I call Minnesota all the time to help me look in Cedric because I just apparently can't figure out Cedric to save my life, to look up specific PFGE patterns to see if there's anything that was going on nationally that may be associated with eggs. And then I also wanted to know if they thought it was worth testing the chicken, which I think I knew the answer to this, but I wanted somebody to tell me, no, don't do it, you'll regret it. So sometimes it's nice to just have people to bounce ideas off of and make sure that you're on the right track and that, other people agree with kind of where you're taking the outbreak and where things are headed. And then additionally, data analysis is not my strong point, so I needed to get something done relatively quickly to get, it was in the news. People were asking questions, and I wanted to have answers for the restaurant as well as for all the people this outbreak affected. So they gave some advice on how to separate out the populations from, an initial group of people that a cross-contamination event could have made sick, and then the second group of people, which you can see here, we analyzed separately to show that ill food handlers really contributed to the rest of the cases that kind of drug out in a second wave in the epidemic curve. So yeah, that's my 2 experiences. But when in doubt, I always call the CoEs. They've never been anything but immensely helpful. So I highly recommend it.
Thank you so much, Anna. Now we will go back and I think David has worked out his audio issues, so we'll try to see if we can have David do his presentation.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yep, we can hear you now.
Okay, oh, how exciting. Okay, so yes, being from one of the smaller states, I think it's really important to use the resources of our teammates in the other states to work on outbreaks and other issues. So I frequently have called the Minnesota Department of Public Health. We had a large S-Tech outbreak a couple of years ago, and we actually had gone through the CDC, but they really weren't as comfortable with local outbreaks and referred us to Minnesota, and they helped us a lot with issues of finding additional cases in the daycare and deciding on exclusions and talking through the consideration to actually close the daycare facility. We also actually talked to the Maryland Department of Public Health as well, because they had a similar outbreak going on at the time. So even though they're not a CoE, I guess, we'll use everybody we can to help us. And on another occasion, well, we've had a lot of trouble getting stool specimens for our norovirus outbreaks from schools in particular. So we were trying to look at other ways to get them. And Minnesota, they use a mailing system to get the stool there. So I spoke to Carlotta about that, and she talked me through how it works there and actually shipped me a full package of what they have. And so we're still getting our ducks all lined up in a row, but we're planning to try to do something similar here in the coming year. We had another outbreak that last November was a big catered event, and I think it was more than 1,000 people. It was an employee appreciation event, and hundreds of people, I think, became ill. And part of the problem was we ended up with incubation periods all over the place from 5 hours to 9 days, and this was for Salmonella. And I was trying to decide, how do I include cases or exclude cases based on the incubation period, or how do I categorize them for primary versus secondary? And Minnesota had done some research on that subject and was able to provide me with a paper to justify counting pretty much all of those cases as primary cases. So, they may not have all been primary cases, but I at least then had a logical scientific reason for what I had done. And Minnesota also helped us with whole genome sequencing testing. At that time, we didn't have the equipment, so that was useful. And then finally, I've been working on reviewing our exclusion criteria here. And one of the concerns I had is I know there's a lot of exclusions in the 2013 FDA Food Code, and I wasn't sure where the information came from that supported the findings that the FDA had gone with. And actually, in talking to the CDC, they provided me with some papers that Colorado had managed to find. And then when I looked at them, they had been written by Minnesota. So I also contacted Minnesota and talked through the findings they had, and also their ultimate decision that even they had originally used those findings to go with their exclusion criteria, and later found that untenable from a practical point of view, and so they went with a different approach. So it was just good to have some people to talk through all those issues. And while I do use the CoEs, I will say I also use neighboring states, Georgia and North Carolina, and other state entities that I'm familiar with to help me with questions that might come up. So I've, for example, New York City is pretty familiar with typhoid fever, so I have called them on occasions when we need information on that. So I highly recommend using both the CoEs and your other state partners as you investigate outbreaks and have questions. So I'll give it back to you, Josh.
Thank you, David. And so our kind of final presenter is Dr. Peter Russo, who's an epidemiologist with the Chicago Department of Health. I will make you the presenter, and then you can take it away.
Okay, thanks. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Great. And my sound is okay?
Yep.
Great. So yeah, I'm going to be talking about our relationship with our Minnesota Center of Excellence in the context of this Salmonella outbreak that we were able to link to a restaurant earlier this summer. So what I'll do, I guess, is I'll provide some details about this outbreak, and then I'll walk us through the timeline of the investigation so that you get a sense of both when and why we reached out to the CoE and what the nature of those conversations was. So before I get into that, just really quick background about our jurisdiction, Chicago. We have an estimated 2.7 million residents in 77 different community areas and more than 7,300 restaurants. We also have over 400 neighborhood festivals a year, and at a lot of those festivals, we're serving food. So there is a lot of potential for the spread of foodborne pathogens in the city, and it's something we have to be vigilant about in our health department. So our health department itself is broken out into a bunch of different public health program areas, and those include the communicable disease and food protection programs. And these are the ones that are really tasked with monitoring for and responding to foodborne outbreak situations in Chicago. Our communicable disease program, we have an enterics team, and that consists of our 2 medical directors, 5 epidemiologists, 11 investigators who are primarily involved with individual case investigation, and then a laboratory liaison because we don't own or operate our own laboratory, so we rely heavily on our Illinois Department of Public Health state lab in these kinds of investigations. So with regards to this particular outbreak, just to give an overview of some of the characteristics, ultimately we had 19 laboratory confirmed cases. This was an outbreak of a relatively rare serotype of Salmonella called Schwarzengrund, and again, this occurred earlier this summer. 18 of the cases had the same PFG pattern. 1 had a slightly different pattern, but it was close enough that we considered that case to be part of the outbreak. The one interesting thing about this outbreak is that most of the cases were really spatially clustered on Chicago's southwest side. Most of them were living in that area on the southwest side of Chicago. We had 13 cases in Chicago, 3 outside of our borders, but still in that area, just outside of the border in larger Cook County. But we also did have 3 outside of the area, 1 in Springfield, Illinois, 1 in Dayton, Ohio, and 1 in Fort Collins, Colorado. The illness onset was, the range was from July 19th to September 8th, so not too long ago. And this seemed to be a relatively nasty strain in that about 50% required hospitalization and around 30% became bacteremic. And we even had a fatality. We were not able to get in touch with, or to speak extensively with this person's survivors, but we did have enough information to think that this person's Salmonella infection was a contributing factor to their death. Now I'll take us through the timeline of the investigation where we reached out to the CoE. So we identified this cluster of Schwarzengrund cases through routine surveillance. You can see in the map where they were all kind of clustered on the southwest side of Chicago. So we prioritized these cases for interview. In Chicago, we use a hypothesis-generating questionnaire for interviews of our enteric cases. And it's pretty much the same one that's used at Minnesota. It's something we borrowed from them. And there are a lot of questions about medical history, symptoms, and then a lot of questions about food exposures. We had administered those questionnaires, and we were beginning to look through the information that we were receiving back to look for commonalities to identify a potential source of this outbreak. By the 11th of August, 2 of the cases had said they had eaten at the same local Jewel Meat and Deli section. And so we sent our food protection team out to do an environmental assessment. But by the 15th of August, we were up to 8 cases. The signal for Joule had kind of dissipated at that point. No one else had reported eating there. And so we didn't have any obvious leads. And then things became even more confusing on the 17th when we learned of a case who was living in Colorado with the same subtype of Salmonella. So at this point, it became a multi-state cluster. It was flagged as such in the CDC's systems. And so now we were communicating with federal, local, and state partners. We were kind of holding these daily calls to discuss what we were getting in the interviews. And we realized we were not getting really great food histories for a lot of the cases. And so nothing was really sticking out. So at this point, we decided to reach out to the CoE to get some guidance. So in our first consultation with Minnesota, we discussed that geographic clustering, which suggested maybe a local source like a restaurant or a grocery store in the area. Minnesota also suggested we re-interview cases in a much more focused way. So we specifically talked about asking cases about any of the restaurants that any of the other cases had reported, including questions about any common grocery stores or any common foods identified. And then we also talked about the potential that ground turkey could be involved. And that was based on prior experience that Minnesota had where, previously they had linked ground turkey exposure to this particular serotype of Salmonella. And then we also discussed some of the case demographics and the neighborhood where a lot of these cases were living. And so based on that, we developed a supplemental questionnaire that was much more focused. And we were focusing on specific restaurants, any common foods or food items. So for instance, a couple of the cases had said that they ate the same brand of frozen pizza or bagged salad. And then based on our conversation about the ground turkey, we did a query of the CDC's PulseNet system using Cedric and found that a few food samples had tested positive for this particular subtype of Salmonella earlier in the year. And those were ground turkey samples and pork products. So we included those items in the questionnaire as well. And so by the 30th of August, we got the second of 2 cases reporting eating at the same barbecue restaurant, and both had reported eating pork rib tips. So we sent out our food protection team to inspect that barbecue restaurant. And so while the food protection team was out at the site, we were still calling our cases and re-interviewing. And we were able to link 2 more cases that day to the restaurant. Oh yeah, I did eat at this restaurant, now that I think about it, when we were asking specifically about the restaurant. And we were also getting information back from our food protection team that there were some pretty egregious practices going on at the restaurant, particularly when it came to holding temperatures for some of their food products. So, for instance, they were cooking their pork rib tips on this big spit, but it was a very small restaurant and they didn't have a whole lot of refrigeration space. So if they if they were outproducing their demand, they were sticking the cooked product in these plastic bins and just setting them out at room temperature. And so the meat, was actually getting down to room temperature. And then there were also some bad food handling practices as well. So based on all this information we were getting, we started questioning when should we pull the trigger and actually take public health action here. At what point can we implicate this restaurant? And so that was the discussion we next had with Minnesota. What do we need to implicate this restaurant? So they recommended that we call back cases who did not report eating at the restaurant to do what we could to kind of refresh their memory, including going through credit card and bank statements, and then even asking, did you eat at, do you ever eat at this restaurant? Did you eat at this restaurant maybe longer than the 7-day period that we were typically asking about? Because Salmonella incubation can be longer than 7 days. And then they recommended these tools that would allow us to kind of mathematically demonstrate an association between eating at this restaurant and the illness. this binomial model idea, where we'd be looking at the percentage of our cases who ate at the restaurant compared to, the percentage of the hypothetical, neighborhood population, the general population, who would be eating at this restaurant. And that would be assuming a binomial distribution. I'll talk about the results of that in a second. And then after that, we also talked about, once we get information back, at what point should we think about closing the restaurant or, implementing, interventions. And so back to the timeline, while our food protection team is noting all of these, bad practices, they're also collecting food specimens for further source identification later on. And then our Epi team is calling up all of our cases, re-interviewing everybody again to ask specifically about this restaurant. And all said and done, we ended up linking about 75% of the total cases to the barbecue ribs restaurant. And of those who were linked, about 100% reported, well, exactly 100% reported eating pork rib tips. And so of the ones we were actually able to contact again, that percentage who ate at the restaurant was even higher. It was around 90% of the people we were actually able to get in contact with reported eating at the restaurant. And even those cases that were outside of the area, so for instance, the Springfield, Illinois case and the Dayton, Ohio case, upon re-interviewing them, it turns out that they had relatives from Chicago drive out to visit them. And you can see in the map where the restaurant is located. But what you can't see is that it's also located right off of a major highway in Chicago. So they had stopped off at this restaurant, picked up pork rib tips, and brought them out to the cases in these other jurisdictions. The Colorado case, we were not able to definitively link to this restaurant, but we learned that the case also had visitors from Illinois who had driven out to see them. And then with the binomial comparison, we were looking at whether the percentage of cases who reported eating at the restaurant was abnormal, was statistically strange compared to some theoretical comparison population. So assuming a binomial distribution of people in the neighborhood who were the probability that they would have eaten at this restaurant, it would have had to have been as high as 75% for what we were seeing, the percentage we were seeing in our cases to be normal. So we decided that 75% sounded like a really high number for the percentage of people who would be expected to eat at this restaurant in the community. So then now we had this kind of mathematical backing that this restaurant could have been the source of the outbreak. So given all this information, we decided it was prudent to have the restaurant, voluntarily close. And this was before a long Labor Day weekend where they were expecting an increase in volume. And then so on the 2nd of September, we get the first of what ended up being 4 food handler specimens testing positive. And then by the 11th of September, the cooked pork rib tips came back positive, whereas the raw rib tips, the raw and cooked pork links, and the sauce all tested negative for Salmonella. And so given all this information, what we ended up concluding was that the source of our cases infections was the exposure to these cooked pork rib tips, and that the pathogen was likely introduced by a food handler at some point. Now, as to where the food handler became infected originally, we were not able to tease that out. And of course, there's uncertainty with all these findings, but that was our ultimate conclusion. And I think that these conversations with our CoE allowed us to make very timely decisions about public health actions we should take. And so, it was hugely beneficial to speak with the CoE in this example. And the CoE has also been extremely helpful to us in other situations. And this week, over the next 2 weeks, we are doing kind of a mock outbreak investigation where they are playing the role of cases that we're calling, and they will be providing us with feedback and helping us to grow as a department when it comes to these outbreak investigations. So yeah, we're hugely indebted to the CoE, and that's where I'll stop.
All right, thank you, Peter. So I hope those examples give you a sense of how the CoEs can serve as a resource to you during cluster and outbreak investigations. So I just want to mention a couple other examples and topics that we can help with. I'll share my screen here. And I hope everyone is able to see my slides and hear me?
Yep, we're good.
Excellent. All right. So in general, we're hoping that you can use the CoEs as a resource during these investigations. We can provide an experienced epidemiologist to discuss the investigation, and really we're another pair of eyes or someone to bounce ideas off of. Some other topic areas, we can discuss lab testing methods. Two of the biggest kind of issues that we're dealing with right now are, culture independent diagnostic tests. Kind of what do those mean? And then now, the emergence of whole genome sequencing and use of that. So we can discuss, how those impact these investigations. We can also help with outbreaks of unexplained etiologies. So if you have an outbreak or you're not getting any positive laboratory results, either provide testing or kind of help discuss, based off the clinical presentation, what an etiology may be. And then another topic area is these newer different Epi methods. So things like the binomial model, using transaction records, online orders, and doing ingredient-specific case control studies. But what I really want to stress is that, these are really informal, peer-to-peer consultations. We're not kind of telling you what to do. This isn't an Epi aid. This is just, kind of us trying to help you kind of do the best investigation that you can. And it's really not a burden on us at all. We're obviously funded as a CoE to be a resource to you guys. So we'd encourage you to reach out to us. So just talking a little bit more about some of these specific examples, cluster investigations can be really challenging. You need to balance the scarce public health resources with the need to identify outbreaks. And this is kind of an art form, deciding, how hard to push and when to continue pushing versus when to kind of wait for additional cases. And, oftentimes, when you see these outbreak investigations presented, they're presented as nice linear processes. But in reality, as Peter was kind of alluding to, they're often much more challenging. You might have false leads or multiple exposures that cases are reporting. And you kind of need to sort through all this information. And so a lot of this nuance can be missed in these presentations and publications. And, I encourage, using the CoEs and even kind of your other experienced epidemiologists around you, to help guide you in these investigations. And as Peter alluded to, one of our first recommendations is often re-interviewing cases, asking cases specifically about all the restaurants reported by any cases in the cluster, asking about any interesting exposures reporting by any cases during that initial interview. Because as we all know, cases aren't remembering exposures during that initial interview. So we're missing a lot of exposure information, and oftentimes we need to talk to people multiple times in order to get kind of good quality exposure information. And then we can kind of help you discuss kind of next steps in the cluster investigation. So for whole genome sequencing, we can provide real-time assistance interpreting WGS results in the context of an active investigation. We've also played a big role in providing additional services to hopefully improve Epi lab communication and help with the implementation of WGS for routine surveillance. Obviously, there are a couple webinars available on there on the CoE website to help kind of give some examples and information. But I'd encourage you, if you're having questions in the midst of investigation, you can reach out to us as well. So, kind of David alluded to this as well. These culture-independent diagnostic tests. How do we use these for exclusion and clearance testing during outbreak investigations? We know that the test performance varies, so it can be really challenging when you're seeing these results to decide how to proceed. So what we can do is kind of discuss your situation and help you come to a decision. I don't think we necessarily have, the definitive answer, but oftentimes it's just help helpful to discuss the situation and kind of decide how to proceed. And then with these outbreaks of unexplained etiology, the Minnesota CoE can provide laboratory testing and then also provide assistance in interpreting, based off the clinical profile of the cases. So a quick example of that is a state had an outbreak where they had specimens that were positive for enteropathogenic E. coli and enteroaggregative E. coli using the BioFire panel. And so it's kind of a difficult question, are these false positives? What do we make of this situation? So we're actually able to get the clinical materials sent over to our laboratory. They were able to isolate both the enteropathogenic E. coli and enteroaggregative E. coli, run PFG on both, and found that they're both indistinguishable from each other. So it turned out to be an outbreak of both EPEC and EAG, and kind of had some discussions with them on what does this mean. And then moving on, there are kind of a variety of newer Epi methods that investigators can use, and it can be really challenging to use a method you're unfamiliar with in the midst of an outbreak investigation. So some of these methods, the binomial probability calculations, transaction records, online orders, ingredient-specific case control studies, which aren't new but we think are really important. And I'll just talk a little bit about each. So these transaction records, we have traditional sources of controls may be limited in certain restaurant outbreak investigations. So you can either have a situation where credit card receipts may not contain a patron name, and oftentimes they're only required for orders over a certain dollar amount. And then your other kind of traditional source may be limited. Those well meal companions may not be able to find enough well meal companions to do an analysis. So you could use these itemized transaction records as controls, or conversely, use them to estimate the background consumption rate of foods in the restaurant. So if you're using them as controls, there are some potential issues like misclassification of cases as controls because you're not getting illness histories from these individuals. And you could also have the situation where a single control, or each record is used as a single control even though some transactions represent meals for multiple people. Obviously, this can vary by restaurant. And kind of these two effects will tend to bias your estimate towards the null. So it's kind of important as you're using these new methods to really be considering, what are the potential issues with them, what are the potential biases, and it can be helpful to kind of discuss this with another experienced epidemiologist as you're considering using these. So these online orders are such a great source for data for restaurant outbreak investigations. They're kind of an Epi's dream, and you can get them both directly through the restaurant and services, so things like Grubhub. If you saw Peter's presentation at Inform on their 0157 outbreak investigation where they use Grubhub, that was a great example. And they're so great because they include exposure data and contact information. So you really only need to get kind of illness history from them. But again, you want to, this is kind of a different method. So what are the potential biases with this? Are people who are ordering online different from other customers? And we kind of found through some of our Chipotle investigations, well, they were less likely to order drinks. And maybe they're a little younger demographic than you see in the general restaurant population. But one of the nice things about these is, it really lowers the resource level to do these case control studies. So we'd really encourage people to kind of keep doing case control studies. And with ingredient-specific case control studies, they're often really crucial to identify a specific vehicle during a restaurant outbreak investigation. But they're a little bit challenging in that you need to work really closely with the restaurant to determine the specific ingredients in each menu item. An issue that comes up, you need to ensure that the restaurant uses the same type of ingredient in each dish. So we've had situations where, the romaine lettuce is actually two products, whole head romaine lettuce and pre-shredded romaine lettuce. And obviously, if you're not aware of this and you're not able to account for that in your ingredient-specific case control study, you could run into issues with that analysis. So kind of one of the big tools that people are really starting to use a lot more frequently are these binomial probability calculations. And this is really happening because these population-based case control studies have become more difficult and are really resource-intensive to conduct. So you can use these to quickly assess potential exposures during cluster and outbreak investigations. Now, the big challenge with them is getting the background consumption rate of the food item of interest, which is something you need to do these. And rarely do perfect background food consumption data, and by that I mean specific, current, and geographically representative data exist for a given food item. So usually you're using various less than perfect sources and then recognizing the limitations of your data. So a lot of people are aware of the FoodNet Population Survey. That data is from 2006, 2007, but it's in the process of being updated, so hopefully in a year or so we'll have new data there. You could also use your aggregated case surveillance data, so your own sporadic cases. Use that as data to come up with a background estimate, and we can help you with that. That's something we've done in Minnesota. Our data is posted online. And then there's also this CoE Project Mercury, which is working to aggregate data from multiple states, and hopefully by early next year we'll have some data available publicly from that as well. So kind of when you're moving from maybe a commercially distributed outbreak to an outbreak within a restaurant, you have to change your population and change your background exposure estimate. So now your population is people who eat at the restaurant, and so you have different data sources to come up with that background exposure estimate. And two examples are kind of these restaurant sales records, online orders, or transaction records. So you really only want to use a background estimate compiled from restaurant data to assess exposures within a restaurant or restaurant chain. So in this example, the FoodNet Exposure Atlas would not be an appropriate data source. So some considerations for when you're trying to choose a background food consumption rate estimate. So obviously recent data are preferred because food consumption patterns can change over time. You want to take into account characteristics of the cluster cases. So if they have a distinct gender, age, race, ethnicity, you want background estimates derived from similar populations. And this is kind of somewhat like matching in traditional case control studies. You also want to think about regional variability. So food consumption patterns can change across states and regions. And then you also want to take into account seasonal variation in the consumption of particular food items. So one thing to consider when you're using sporadic case data for your background rate is that you can have situations where this is biased towards the null. So you could think of a situation where the observed consumption rate for a known vehicle, so you have ground beef and E. coli 157, may be higher than in the general population. So this could limit your ability to find a statistically significant association, even if that food item is the source of the outbreak. And some other tricks with these binomial models, if you don't have data available for the specific food item of interest, you could use data for a similar food item or make an educated guess. It's often best to be conservative and err on the high side. But an example of this, so we had a E. coli 157 outbreak that was due to in-shell hazelnuts. And we didn't have any background food consumption rate estimates for in-shell hazelnuts. So we used cashews as a proxy, kind of with the knowledge that we thought, this is a very conservative estimate. We think the background rate for in-shell hazelnuts is much lower than cashews, but allowed us to actually kind of put this into the model and come up with an association. And then another thing you can do is plug in a variety of background estimates to see how they may change or not change your conclusion. So for example, how high does the background estimate need to be to not find a significant association? And is this plausible? So, Peter gave that example with the restaurant, and in this example of the 0157 hazelnut investigation, we needed something like 40 or 50% of cases eating in-shell hazelnuts in a given week for this not to be significantly associated with illness. So that gave us kind of more confidence in kind of this association. So when you're interpreting these, kind of the interpretation is by chance alone, how likely are we to find X of N people or more eating a given food item? And the big thing is this enough to conclude that the food item is the cause of the outbreak kind of by itself? Well, not usually. But what it does is it indicates that efforts to confirm this hypothesis, so things like tracebacks, food testing, are reasonable to pursue. And it can help you kind of weed through if you have multiple kind of common exposures, help you prioritize, maybe which exposure to focus on. So, kind of the CoEs are really here to be a resource to you. If you don't know who to contact, I would encourage you to reach out to your regional CoE, but they're really meant to be kind of a guide to the CoEs, and so feel free to reach out to any center that you'd like to. I'll just mention, in addition to these consultation services, I'd encourage you to look at coefoodsafetytools.org for trainings and resources that can help you improve your outbreak investigations. And I'll specifically highlight, there's an outbreak outbreak investigation case studies from several of the centers, a binomial model spreadsheet developed by Oregon. There's trainings on conducting environmental assessments, and key points documents on product tracebacks, investigating subclusters, and gathering food transaction records from credit and debit cards. So kind of what we really want to do is give you the confidence to effectively use these Epi methods, whole genome sequencing, or interpreting culture-independent diagnostic tests in order to have successful outbreak investigations. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone for dialing in today, and then I think we can open it up to questions. And Tamara, I'm not sure if you're able to kind of unmute everybody or if that's something I have to do. Let's see. Unmute all. There we go.
Let me just add before you take any questions. I just want to say quickly that we are planning to have another.
I get out at 3:30 usually. I work 7 to 3:30.
WGS courses that we can provide. So that's definitely something that is down the pike. You can give your phones unless you're going to ask a question.
Later tomorrow then. Okay.
Also, I would like to.
I muted everyone, and Tamara, unmute yourself.
Right in the middle, I tell you.
Yeah.
I was just saying that, we really do love hearing from other jurisdictions. We don't mind at all being asked for any sort of assistance. It doesn't matter if it seems like it's something that's out of left field. That's what we're here for, is to bounce ideas off of us. And I would also say we learn as much from our other partners in other jurisdictions as we provide assistance. I feel like every time we interact with another jurisdiction, we learn a lot too, and so we really enjoy doing it. Don't ever feel like it's a burden to us. So with that, I'll mute myself from questions.
So I see a question in the chat. Let me pull that up. So this is from Jenny. Did Chicago consider environmental sampling the restaurant to target the source of the Salmonella? So I don't know, Peter, if you'd like to take a stab at that question. And you have to unmute yourself, sorry. Peter, are you there? You might be having a little audio problem, so I can take a stab. Oh.
And may need to unmute the phone as well as on WebEx. You can be muted on. Like.
Give him one more second to try that. Well, I'll take a stab at that, and maybe Peter can correct me if I'm interpreting this wrong. So one of the challenges with their investigation is, they had that kind of bimodal epi curve, and they really think, maybe those initial cases were due to cross-contamination, but then the larger kind of later epi curve was due to ill food workers. So there's kind of this debate, should we do sampling at this time? And kind of by the time, they were out at the restaurant, they were really at that part of the epi curve where they thought the food workers were playing the big role in transmission, and thought, maybe that would be more, any environmental sampling would be more indication of, where the food workers contaminating things as opposed to raw cross-contamination. And so, kind of I think the decision was made at that point, maybe not to sample, but, Peter can correct me if I'm wrong, maybe in the chat feature, if they did end up doing sampling, and it just didn't find any positive results with that. And so any other questions? I'm not sure if you're not able to kind of unmute your line, you can type it in the chat box. Giving everyone a minute to type quickly. Well, I'm not seeing any other questions, so I think we can adjourn and give you back 4 minutes of your time. But again, feel free to reach out to us if you have any additional questions. I would like to thank our presenters for doing a great job. They were picked on at Inform with multiple presentations and then having this webinar right the week after they got back. So big thank you to them. We'll kind of end it at that. Thank you, everyone.